Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode and the first in our new mini-series on ELT Buzzwords. In this series, we'll be talking about words or phrases that are common in ELT, particularly at this moment in time. Our first episode is all about mediation, something which, as a teacher, materials writer or editor, I'm sure you've come across recently. Here to tell us more is Ethan Mansur and Riccardo Chiappini, whose book on all things mediation is being published with ELT Publishing this coming August.
Hi, Billy.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. How are you?
Good, yeah, good, thank you. Hi, Riccardo, how are you?
Hi, Billy. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Nice to meet you. So let's start by hearing a little bit about yourselves. Let's start with you, Ethan.
So I'm primarily a teacher. I teach in International House here in Madrid. But about a year and a half ago, I started doing some freelance materials writing, and a lot of that has to do with mediation. Actually, almost all of it has to do with mediation. I've done some work for the Spanish Ministry of Education along with Riccardo. We've worked together on a lot of things. Together, we've also written a course, teacher training course for Oxford University Press here in Spain. And right now we're working together on a book about mediation for ELT Publishing.
Excellent. And how did you first become interested in mediation?
So I was doing a master's at the University of Leicester, and basically I was doing the part of my master's on materials development, and they had just updated the CEFR. They had just released this new companion volume to the Common European Framework of Reference, and my wife works in the field of language testing, and she told me about it. And I was just looking through the document. I noticed that there was this entire huge section about mediation. So I thought that, that was something I didn't know anything about, and that maybe it had some potential for, materials development. And so I wrote a very long paper sort of talking about how the new mediation descriptors could be kind of exploited to create crossing tasks. And that's basically kind of what got me started.
Excellent. Great. And Riccardo, what about you?
Yes, hi. I'm an ELT teacher, teacher trainer and writer. To talk about myself, I literally stumbled into ELT when I was still at university. I was already working as a translator interpreter, but I never really thought about teaching English. So I just stumbled into that, and then I moved to Spain. I did my CELTA at International House Madrid, and then I was offered a job straight after that, and then all the rest happened. ELT, teacher training, materials writing, and mediation, and so on.
Excellent, great. And how did you first become interested in mediation? Was it through Ethan?
Yeah, there was let's make that sorts of connection between Ethan and my pastors, because I did have I had to use the CEFR quite a lot at university. I studied translation studies, and mediation came out quite often in lectures and exams. Mm-hmm. But I'd practically forgot everything about that until a couple of years back, when Ethan sent me the slides for a seminar on mediation that he was going to give at International House. So he asked me to have a look at them and to look at the slides and come up with some comments. And I looked at it, it's it's a great topic, but mate, there's nothing you can do out of these descriptors. There's no classroom application. So I kind of sat back and I want to prove myself wrong. It was, within the same day. And I was going to cover a class. So I kind of thought, I'm going to experiment. I'm going to try and make a mediation task. And, it went quite well. It was my first ever mediation task. I sent it to Ethan, and he was quite happy with it. And it just came up with, we can write a book with, a resource book of mediation tasks. And here we are today.
That's great. And so you came up with the idea for the book yourself. Were you going to self-publish it initially, or were you going to pitch it to different publishers?
No, we sent it to the biggest possible publisher. We sent it around to quite a few places, and we're super happy that Delta accepted it. It's a great place. I think it's the perfect place to publish about a new topic like this one.
Right, and it's unusual, isn't it? Because often if you just send sort of an unsolicited sort of manuscript or something like that, publishers don't really take them. So that's excellent.
Yeah, we seem to have proved that wrong. That seems to be something people say is a waste of time, but well, I guess it sort of was, because we sent it to so many places, but in the end it was not. So yeah, if anybody else out there has a great idea for something, it's worth a try.
Excellent.
For sure.
That's great. So maybe let's start with defining mediation. What is it exactly?
The short version would be like to customize information for someone. So it's about helping people understand the texts, concepts, and each other's opinions and values, just by taking into account their knowledge, their values, and cultural background. For a longer explanation, then we have a three-pointed end, which is like the three different categories and three different flavors of mediation, which is text, concepts, and communication. And it's still about helping. It's always about helping. So we can say mediation is the process of helping someone understand information contained in texts, be they spoken, written, or visual, like a graph or an infographic. And there would be mediating a text. But mediation is also the process of co-constructing meaning when involved in group work. Okay. And so someone also defined it as talking ideas through with someone to create new ideas, reach solutions, and reach conclusions and find solutions. And this would be mediating concepts. Mediating communication, on the other hand, would be helping other people understand each other's, again, values, opinions, while involved in interpersonal communication.
But I think for anybody out there who's kind of new to mediation, I think Riccardo definitely put the focus where it should be, is sort of helping people, facilitating. You're facilitating understanding, you're facilitating interaction. It's all about helping people, basically.
So is the teacher the mediator, or do the students mediate between each other?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So actually, the way that mediation is described in the CEFR, it's always the students doing it. Basically, the CEFR describes what they call language activities, which are sort of real life situations where learners or students will be using their second language. But actually, mediation itself is something that teachers do all the time. One interesting thing about sort of doing mediation in class is that you're often kind of helping students develop or practice skills or competencies that are more often associated with the teacher. So for example, as Riccardo was saying, when you're facilitating understanding of maybe the contents of a text or something, that's something we do all the time as teachers. And we also facilitate sort of access to more complex information or knowledge, like grammar or something. When we sort of simplify it, we customize it, as Riccardo said. We help people understand it. And, when you think about it, that's one reason I think that we should be doing more mediation, because that's actually something you have to do when you're speaking a second language all the time, not only in class, but out in the real world when you're using it.
A lot of people that I've spoken to, and a lot of people that have asked me questions about it if I've been working on a project, is it translating from L1, or like, do you use your L1 at all, or is it specifically only in English?
If I may, it's like mediation is, of course, it could be L1 to L2 and L2 to L1. It depends on the purpose of the mediation per se. So, of course, mediation is passing information. So it could be an L1, L2, a different mode, sign language, it could be anything. Okay. So the strategies that you want your students to develop and refine obviously depend on what you're teaching them. It's true that even if you do, like, for example, we teach in Spain, so from Spanish into English would be probably the type of mediation that teachers might be more ready to accept in their classes, but also the other way around might be useful too, because it happens in the real world where the students live, or we live.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to sort of what needs helping, what people need help with. They might need help understanding something because in a different language, which would certainly involve sort of moving from L1 to L2. But maybe somebody needs help understanding something because they simply haven't had the time or energy to go read about it, and you have. Or maybe something is just sort of too complex or involves, sort of includes maybe too much information and you need it to be simplified. But yes, it can involve translation, so some degree of translation for sure.
And is it one of those things that we've always done as teachers, or is it actually a new thing?
Yes and no. I think it's sort of both new and old. There's certainly lots of activities that we do all the time in class. For example, like an info gap activity where two students have sort of two different sources of information, and they're sort of pooling those together in order to make a decision or just inform each other. That's definitely a mediation task, and we've been doing it forever. However, I do think that the way that mediation is described in the CEFR definitely opens up a lot of new possibilities. I know that Riccardo and I, when we started reading more about mediation, I think it definitely opened our eyes to a lot of activities that we had never done before in class. Specifically kind of this idea of putting somebody in the role of a mediator and thinking of that as being, something to get better at, basically. Yeah. So I think in many ways it is old, and I think that's one reason why it shouldn't be as kind of scary or something to new teachers who aren't familiar with it, because actually they know mediation already. They've just been calling it by a different name, maybe integrated skills or info gap but I do think that it does deserve to be thought of as something new, because there are a lot of activities that we could be doing in class, but we aren't.
Mm-hmm. I'd say, I totally agree with you. It's about refining, I think, because in the end, if you think about it, everyone is a mediator. When you think about children's book writers, they're mediators, parents are mediators, teachers are mediators by definition. I think there's a mixture of old and new.
I think it's just seeing the word mediation, especially if you've been teaching for a number of years, and then you see this new concept coming in, you think, oh, how can I try and include that in my lessons? And I think you're doing it in sort of an explicit way, whereas actually it's sort of an implicit thing, really, isn't it? It just sort of comes into the lesson sometimes, maybe.
More systematic.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Yeah, and I think kind of thinking of it as something that students can get better at. Mm-hmm. It was kind of always there, but maybe because we weren't focusing on it, we weren't helping students get better at it in the way that we could be if we were focusing on it. I think a good example is like that info gap activity that teachers have done 100 times, including myself. But if you think about it as a mediation activity, you start thinking, well, how well are they summarizing that information? Mm-hmm. Because I think actually if you kind of observe your students, well, sometimes they're either just kind of passing on all of the information and not putting it in their own words and not sort of trying to facilitate it or anything. Maybe sometimes they're even just passing on random information instead of passing on main points. Mm-hmm. I think when you kind of start thinking about that type of task as a mediation task, you start thinking about how you could help students develop strategies to do it better.
So you've mentioned summarizing sort of an information gap activity. What are some other activities that practice mediation?
But give me a mediation strategy on me. It could be, thinking about different target audience. If you think about YL or older students, if we think about summarizing or paraphrasing, but even translating. Let's make an example with translating, which worked with the other two as well. You might have a model text, or even a short section of it, a paragraph, or even a sentence. And you would have the translation of it in the student's outline. You might frame it as a multiple choice option, for example. These are which translation fits better to the context, with the context. And you would have maybe 3 options. With younger learners, maybe you would have 3 options in which only one is correct. With older students or higher level students, you would have the 3 options being correct, but only one being appropriate to the context.
I think another kind of classic mediation task is giving students some type of text and then asking them to give someone advice or inform somebody, like a specific sort of target audience with specific communicative needs. For example, you could have the students sort of listen to some kind of recording in the course book about Thailand or something, and you could say, well, listen, you have a friend who's interested in traveling to Thailand. Well, what information from listening do you think would be kind of useful or interesting to that person? Try to summarize it for them in 1 minute or something. So they have to sort of condense the information and think about, sort of prioritize what information they think would be most useful to that person.
And what about sort of neurodiverse learners or learners with difficulties, sort of maybe they need a bit longer to read a text or something like that? Does mediation take that into consideration as well?
That's mediation per se.
Okay.
I think it's like you have to think about your learners, that you are the teacher and you are the mediator. How can I pass this information through and on to my students? So I have to take into consideration, it's like thinking about how would you explain the concept of, I don't know, black holes or gravity to a 4-year-old child or maybe a little bit older. You would just kind of think about their cognitive skills they possess. So what they can and can't understand. And that's mediation per se. So when you've just framed that, then you can think about how to relay the information. It's like with any mediation task for young learners, it's about helping people, in this case, younger people, understand text concepts and each other. So mediation is for all ages. So you as a teacher would do exactly the same you'd do for any other skill. So you'd grade the task and the strategies, but the process of mediation itself is the same. So you'd obviously take into account the cognitive skills the students possess, and I don't know, for a mediating a text task, for example, you'd provide students with a simpler info. If it's an explain data type of activity, you would give them a simpler infographic that they can read, maybe bigger pictures, if we're talking about, depending on the specific needs. So something that they can read, analyze, and evaluate themselves.
So does it matter if you're face-to-face or in an online classroom, you can still do mediating concepts, mediation activities in both the remote and face-to-face classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly mediation tasks that would be more difficult to do in an online classroom, but I think that there are any kind of activity that's going to be harder to do in an online classroom for whatever reason. But I mean, in the book that we've written, for each of the tasks, the editor asked us to include some suggestions for the online classroom, whether it be synchronous or asynchronous. And it wasn't terribly hard to think about how the task could be done online. Both of us have a lot of online teaching experience. So,
what if you have one-to-one students? Is it harder to do it then?
No, actually not, because sort of the imaginary kind of target audience for example, mediating a text task doesn't necessarily have to be present in the classroom. You could have a friend who's interested in a certain topic. You give the students some information about that topic, and they think about what information they would prioritize in terms of informing that other person. However, there are certainly types of mediation that involve sort of maybe resolving conflicts or working in groups that would be effectively impossible with one-to-one.
That's the problem with one-to-one classes. You can't really have group work or pair work.
It would limit you, certainly. So you could probably have some type of role play involving just two people. However, it seems like most often the tasks that we've written involving kind of role play or group work, there really needs to be a few people around, with one person in the role of the mediator, then other people kind of in other roles.
Yeah. And so is it something that we should make students aware of? We should say this is a mediating concept, a mediation task, or is it something that we don't really need to make them aware of, but as a teacher we should know that it is a mediation task?
I'm not sure where I come down on that. Riccardo, what do you think?
I was thinking about the same example, because I made the example with the phonemic chart, right? The Africa, the ch sound. I mean, you do that with students, right? I mean, you tell them that they're phonemes, that they're symbols, they represent how we tell them, oh yeah, your lips, etc., etc. Why not? It always depends on the level and how useful it is. Maybe they don't need to know like mediating a text, mediating concepts of communication, but they do need that it's like about helping other people. They are doing this work so that the other person on the other side can understand you better. So that's the objective of mediation. I want to go into class and say, today, guys, we're going to do mediation and we're going to just from the CEFR. It's like, no.
I can't think of one specific context where you would want to tell students you're doing mediation. Like here in Spain and in Greece and lots of other countries, they're starting to put specific types of mediation on exams. So here in Spain, for example, they have mediation, so written mediation, where students are given a text and then they have to create a new text for a new target audience based on the source text. And they have to do also a spoken mediation task where they are given some type of text and then they have to sort of talk about it and sort of pass on information or summarize information. So in that context, you really would want to tell students that they were practicing mediation, because it's something they'll need to do on their exam, and it's actually called mediation on the exam. So yeah, again, you just sort of, I think you can think about how much your students really need to know about how things are classified.
And maybe that would help them understand sort of how what they're learning in the class relates to the outside world, perhaps. Maybe they would see it as a benefit because they would have to paraphrase something perhaps in the outside world, or maybe give information to someone who hasn't been in the situation. Like if we're having a conversation, then I want to relay it to someone else. Maybe students would see that as a benefit if you did sort of highlight the mediation aspect.
This is probably one of the very first conversations Ethan and I had about cross-linguistic mediation. I had this class, wonderful group of students. They were all C1, so this kind of makes things easier. It made things easier for sure. So we were talking about mediation, in fact. We were talking about, but we didn't really say like this is mediation. It just kind of elicited situations in which students had to translate for someone else because they needed help. And we came up with, the board was full of things, helping jurists understand what they had to do to solve issues with the metro ticket, with the underground ticket and everything. Helping someone get in touch with a long lost relative, translating, understanding what the email or the letter said and so on. So it's basically, I think, the very first thing, more than saying this is mediation, is like, this is what happens in real life. And then, guys, this is also called mediation if you want to, but it's not like that. I wouldn't say, this is mediation, by the way. So this is the process in which.
This is a fantastic idea that Riccardo came up with. She's like, we should just ask our students. Like, when we think of ideas for tasks, basically, we were brainstorming. We were like, well, why don't we just ask the students? I was like, oh yeah, it's true. And Riccardo just went into class and just kind of gave them a basic idea of what mediation was. And so what are some situations where you do this in your everyday life? And of course they came up with a million examples. And I think it did two things. I think it convinced us even more that mediation was something important and something that we should be doing in class. I think it also convinced the students that it was something that they should be doing in class as well, because if they're doing it all the time outside of class, then surely that's something they should be doing in class. And also in the same way, it explained mediation by, coming up with a lot of common sort of everyday examples of it. So.
And do you think that, obviously we've talked a lot about teachers, but what about materials writers, as you guys both write materials? Do you think that we should write with mediation in mind, even if it's not explicitly in a brief?
Definitely, 100%.
Why do you think it's important?
Well, I think, as we said, it's something that we have been doing for a long time, but not focusing on. It's something that students do all the time outside of class. And if it's a valuable life skill, then it's something I think we have the responsibility to help students get better at.
Maybe I would say they shouldn't probably label it as mediation if the brief doesn't specify it. If you can still create a gorgeous, a beautiful mediation task without labeling it mediation. Ethan, years ago, it's 2 years ago, he was talking about the proficiency exam or the Trinity exams as well. And in many tasks, was that the writing paper?
The mediation task on the C2 proficiency exam for Cambridge. It's not called mediation.
No, not at all.
100% mediation.
But it is. It's 13 information from two or three different sources together to create a new text. It's true. Mediation is there, but it depends on what.
The IELTS exam, they give you a graph and then you have to write about it.
That's true.
That's 100% mediation. These are just examples of things that would be classified as mediation now that we have kind of a better description of it.
Do you know who first introduced the mediation descriptors into the CEFR?
So mediation was in the first version of the CEFR in 2001.
Okay.
They basically, the people that designed the CEFR, they weren't very satisfied with reading, writing, speaking, and listening, sort of this 4 skills thing, because they thought that a lot was being left out. So they basically created new categories to describe sort of what people do when they speak a second language: reception, interaction, and mediation. And they sort of put everything into those 4 categories. So basically the 4 skills would fit into reception and production. And then you have interaction and mediation. And it's very interesting. You were mentioning earlier about if we've been doing it all along, what's the point in sort of focusing on it? I think that interaction is a perfect example of that, because actually before the CEFR put a focus on interaction in its first version, it wasn't on any exams. It wasn't really something that course books focused on either. they just thought of speaking as being speaking, you know. But of course, there's a huge difference between sort of a co-constructed dialogue and a monologue. Nowadays, on newer exams like the Trinity exams or the Cambridge Suite exams, you have an actual mark for interaction, and you have candidates speaking to each other. But on older exams like IELTS that were developed before the CFR, they don't include any interaction at all, as if it sort of didn't exist, you know. And I think mediation is going to be the same, you know. It's true that interaction was always there as well, but we didn't necessarily spend a lot of time teaching turn taking and stuff like that. So I think that now that there's this new focus on mediation, I think that sort of going forward, we'll start seeing a lot more mediation on exams, a lot more mediation in course books, a lot more mediation in the classroom.
Definitely.
So when a materials writer first gets a brief and it says, or say they get asked to do a mediation project, for example, probably they know the publisher already, so they don't have to do a sample. They get the brief and they have a task to write, let's say, some worksheets about mediation or a video page about mediation. Where should they start? What would you recommend them to do?
I wouldn't probably tell them to go straight into the CFR, but to keep it very close at hand. I would just probably tell them to, if they get this brief next year saying starting from September or even August, I would say probably read our book first. It's much easier. But most of what we did was we read what the best ones at this did. So Tim Goodyear's webinars and articles, Enrica Picardo and Brian North's work on mediation. So it's still about probably Picardo's and North's work more about academia is for academia, you could say. But Tim Goodyear was probably the one who brought mediation into ELT. So I would recommend his webinars, Pearson's webinars and his articles on the Advancing Learning blog as well, because he talks about anything. He talks about young learners, he talks about adults. The three of them belong to the authoring body of the CFR, so they are the very authors of the CFR as well. So quite authoritative figures. I
think I might disagree slightly. I think materials writers are probably already familiar with the CFR to a certain extent. So I don't know. I don't think I would say go and read the whole section on mediation. But if you're given a brief that says you have to write a B1 mediation activity, and they're pretty clear about kind of the source of the information or something, or if it's a video, as you mentioned, I mean, you could just go and look at some of the descriptors for B1. You know, students can relay straightforward information from, a source of information that doesn't include too much complexity. The descriptors are like general, but also specific in a way. And I think they also contain within them sort of the possibility of a lot of different tasks. So I think that, I think reading some of those B1 descriptors can be a great place to start when you're thinking about creating a mediation task for a specific sort of level.
The only thing that I'm thinking about is ourselves at the beginning when we were talking about mediation, we didn't really know which mediation category to look at, which descriptor, because there are three categories, lots of groups, and then you get lost. It's like, I can't do it. It's like, or can you tell me what I have to do and not do it? So probably I was thinking about that. Because I didn't say that, very good point. Like I wrote exams for the Spanish Ministry of Education, but I knew already, thanks to the work we'd done, Ethan and I had done on the That's English course book series, it was about mediating texts only in a sort of way. So I knew that they wanted that type, and it was only cross-linguistic, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's not a mistake, but I think it's one thing publishers could get slightly better at is kind of specifying what type of mediation they want. Because kind of like asking a writer to write a speaking activity. Well, okay, but there's lots of different types of speaking activities. It could be a discussion, it could be a presentation. I think, I want a mediating a text task. I want an explaining data task. I want some infographic or some graphics, and I want the students to have to explain that information somehow. I think that would make our lives as writers easier than saying, okay, I want 10 mediation activities.
Which is currently what writers get given, I think, from my own experience.
Yeah.
So, Riccardo, you mentioned a lot of good resources, and we'll try and get some links to where people can read those books. And obviously, you guys have got a book coming out as well on mediation. Was it September time, you said?
It's August 2nd, is that okay?
2nd of August, correct.
Okay, great. And are there any other sort of useful webinars or any further reading that you would recommend that you haven't mentioned already?
So I think I would go back to Tim Goodyear as I think he tragically passed away, but I think he was the best mediator for mediation out there. I would just Google his name with mediation and start there.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's been more and more stuff about mediation. I see more conference talks about mediation. There's this Oxford mediation course, for example. There's a very interesting position paper written by Tim Goodyear from Oxford University Press that really explains mediation, I think, very clearly. But yeah, in terms of what's out there at the moment, most of the writing on mediation is still quite academic. There's definitely a space to fill there that we are in our small way trying to fill.
I was going to say, you guys are leading the way.
a lot more mediation of mediation than.
Yeah, we started with this book, the cross-lingual mediation by Dr. Maria Stathopoulou, probably one of the first ones to write about mediation in that way. Still, I mean, it's very practical in some sections, but still quite, for academia. But again, Tim Goodyear for sure. He's the mediator of mediation, and across quite a few publishers as well. For UP, for Pearson's, for Macmillan, he did quite a lot of work and how to make it more real for ELT teachers.
Riccardo and I have also published a few articles in various places.
You'll be the go-to experts for mediation. Next time someone asks me this question, I'll direct them to you guys.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you that's what you get called after writing about something.
Okay, so I thought we could go through some of the mediating descriptors. First of all, let's just clarify. You said that there's 3 different sort of channels, so to speak. What are the 3 main sort of headers in mediation? You said that communication,
mediating text or mediating a text, and then mediating concepts.
So all of these descriptors sort of fit under one of those 3 headers. So I'm going to sort of give you a mediating descriptor or mediation descriptor. And if you could just give me an example of sort of a task that a teacher or perhaps a materials writer could use to practice this specific type of mediation, I think that'll just give some really practical advice for listeners to take away as well. So the first one is collaborating to construct meaning.
So collaborate to construct meaning, it's not very different from any other type of group work activity. In this case, we could think about of having students work in groups, giving each team member, each student in each group, a text about something, and then putting the information they gather together to create something. I'm going to make it a little bit more specific. So let's say that you want students to learn more about a particular concept like black holes. So you have 3 texts or more about different aspects of black holes. So I don't know, you would give one student a text about the physical characteristics of a black hole, another student a text about the concept of event horizon. You break up the concept of black holes into small puzzle pieces, and then they have to put them back together. For example, by creating a poster at the end, or a written report, or an article, or a simple description. So the students work together. They each have a particular role. Each one of them have a particular task to carry out. So reading the texts, extracting, identifying the key points from those texts, and then passing them on to the rest of the group so that they can all decide what should go onto the poster or into the article or report.
Excellent. Facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements.
This one lends itself to role play when you think about it. So you could basically just have students agreeing or disagreeing about things. We kind of do that a lot in class. But then you could kind of insert the role of the mediator. You could have a student whose job it is to kind of find some middle ground between the 2 positions. I think a classic sort of activity we do in class all the time is a debate. where you sort of make students argue for or against something. But that activity could be adapted into a mediation task for facilitating communication very easily by assigning somebody to be the role of the mediator, and that they need to help those two parties find some middle ground.
Excellent. The next one we have is translating a written text in speech.
Yes, you would have a text in the student's L1, and the students have to translate it orally to someone else into, for example, English, so an additional language, or a DL to the student. Let's say that you have someone from abroad that is visiting you, so that imaginary situation, a friend from England is visiting you, and they've lost something like their passport or a laptop, and they have to do something to try and retrieve it. The students would receive maybe they could go and find the corresponding information on the lost and found. So the lost and found section on the website of the transport company, and translate that information for them. Maybe they have to call someone, they have to fill out a form, etc., and that's where the mediator, the students, would have to translate for the friend from abroad.
Perfect. The next one we have is expressing a personal response to creative texts.
It is what it sounds like. You read something like a book or a poem or something, and then you express your personal opinion about it. You're sort of relaying or helping someone understand how you felt when you were reading it. A very natural sort of context for this is like a book club, or sort of, like a reading circle. This idea of extensive reading that's quite common in ELT can easily be exploited for mediation tasks. You can have students reading different books, and you can have them write summaries or provide sort of character descriptions to each other, or there's just, if the students aren't all reading the same book, then there's just a lot of room for sharing and expressing your personal response to what you read.
And would you have to respond? So if you told me your opinion or your response to something, would I have to respond and sort of delve deeper into that? Or can it just be one person giving their opinion?
As it's in terms of mediation, as long as you're passing on sort of information or a message, in this case, this is a mediating a text type of task.
Yeah.
Of course, it's more interesting if students have to engage with what their partner is kind of relaying to them. So turning into kind of a discussion or something would of course be sort of more interesting in the concept of the classroom. But in terms of mediation, the idea of, for example, reading something and writing a review about it, that would be mediation.
Okay, excellent. The next one is processing text in writing.
Right. You would give your students a text about a particular topic. For example, something that they can do better, like let's say that you have a group of students who wants to learn how to take notes more effectively and efficiently. So you will give them probably, they will listen to a lecture about different ways of how to take notes more efficiently, and then they have to, of course, identify the main points, the key points, and then relay these to someone who's in need of understanding how to take their notes more effectively.
So can it be a reading text, or does it have to be a listening?
It could be anything. It could be a reading text, it could be a listening text, it could also be an infographic. It depends on how the information is laid out, or even from notes. So it's like a meta notes.
Good. The next one is encouraging conceptual talk.
So it's more of a scaffolding activity that you would use within a mediation task.
Okay.
So, for example, you would have, like, as I've interpreted encouraging conceptual talk, you would have the basic form would be having someone telling you about a topic, about a concept, explaining a concept to you. And then the next step would be you passing the same concept on to someone else. Okay. And the first person who passed the concept on to you being the mediator and checking that you're doing it okay, that you're doing it well. So an idea would be probably a scaffolding activity would be like you have a definition and you have a target audience. I don't know, someone is really interested in surfing but doesn't really know much about it. Maybe they've just had a couple of classes and they don't know what a particular, a backhand is, or another particular type of word within that particular discipline, and they have to explain it to someone who doesn't really know much about surfing in this case. And so the first group of students explains the word, then they pass it on to another group, and the group makes it better. And then they pass it on to a third group who makes it better, either by explaining more, summarizing, cutting, shortening the definition, repolishing it, etc., etc.
Okay. And what about this one? I think this one's quite tricky every time I come across it. Facilitating pluricultural space.
Yeah, this one, unlike expressing a personal response, it doesn't really explain itself very well, does it? So basically in the CFR, pluricultural means basically instead of multicultural, where different cultures are kind of coinciding or sort of coexisting together, pluricultural is sort of cultures sort of coming together and mixing. A good example is somebody like me who's from the United States but has lived in Spain for a long time. I'm kind of pluricultural at this point. Like I have a mixture of kind of American and Spanishness in me. So anyway, if you wanted to help your students get better at this, a very common kind of task type that lends itself to this is role play, where students are given some type of situation where they require some kind of intercultural competence. So there are sort of people from different cultures meeting, and there's a misunderstanding, and that they have to think about sort of strategies for resolving that type of intercultural problem. A very common place for this that teachers will be very familiar with is in multilingual, sort of multicultural classes, where people sort of come from different places and have different opinions about things. Yeah. Or like a summer camp in England that I'm sure most of us have worked at one point or another, where you have different people maybe living in the same house, different people from different countries, and they have to decide, what they're going to eat, when they're going to eat, sort of all these different cultural differences that they need to be not resolved, but they need to kind of coexist, and they need to kind of be understood in order for people to feel comfortable.
And is there one mediation task or one mediation descriptor that you think is generally covered more than others in lessons at the moment or in materials at the moment?
Absolutely. So it seems to me that the mediation, at least for exam boards and for the limited number of course books that include mediation, including ones that we've worked on, very focused on mediating texts. Yeah. And they're very focused on basically three types. Processing text, where you're kind of getting the general idea and passing on the main points, relaying specific information, where you're finding specific relevant information for a specific target audience, and then explaining data, where you're basically doing the same thing, but it involves sort of visual information like data. Those three categories are the ones that have really been focused on so far on exams and also in published materials.
So thank you both so much for coming on to have a chat. We can get some of the links to the books that you mentioned, and Tim Goodyear would again be really useful as well, I think, and we can put them along with links to the recording.
Bye now. Thank you.
Bye, thank you. So thanks so much for listening to the show today. We really hope it went some way to helping define mediation and has given you some inspiration for your own classroom activities or your coursebook materials. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube for our latest episodes, job posts and ELT updates. See you soon.